It's not that we're just taking buildings down. We are trying to take those buildings away from demolition machines. They're destroying the building so efficiently that it makes it hard to compete with. So we've had to go further in our effort to save those buildings. It's not just the hard work of disassembling it, it's figuring out how to take that building away from the machines in an effort to keep it out of the landfill.
In the world of deconstruction and circularity, nearly all roads lead back to a handful of industry vanguards, one of whom is Dave Bennink, more commonly known as Deconstruction Dave. Dave has been working to shepherd deconstruction and reuse into the mainstream for the better part of 3 decades. He brought a reuse innovation center to Bellingham, Washington, and is now developing one in New York City. He founded the Building Deconstruction Institute, has led countless deconstruction efforts in cities across the country, and is routinely recruited by economic development organizations to help embed circular principles into local economies. But what drew him to such a physically, emotionally, and mentally demanding mission? It was the demolition of his high school and a fortuitous college internship.
It's funny how things work out. When I was in college, my high school that I graduated from was demolished. And the community tried to save things from it, and they wouldn't let them, And the community got upset about the watching this massive waste, this massive single concentrated example of waste, right? And so they got together after that happened and said, what are we going to do about it? Because it's just a matter of time before the next school or the next whatever. It's just a coincidence that it was my high school, right? But I think that that got the group, interested in starting a store that would sell used building materials, and it would collect used building materials, and it would actually be a licensed contractor, so it could go into the school. It would be insured to go in the school, right? And I needed an internship, so my internship was to help start that operation. And I found out later that the genesis of it was my high school, so I thought that was meaningful, right? It was too late to save my own school, so I was going to save everyone else's schools. So now we're on, we've done 182 schools. So where we've gone in and saved materials, and then many times we get that material back to people who went to school there. So we couldn't save the whole school, but we could get parts of it back to people that it had meaning for, and so that's how I got started in this. And then I got really addicted to the win-win scenarios that we were generating. Things like that, where now when we do a school, we not only save the material from the dump, we not only get it back to alumni of the school that care about it, but we also turn it into a fundraiser for the schools, and it ends up being a real win-win-win that way.
Yeah, I would. It seems like all around it just produces these good feelings. So, how did you learn the proper deconstruction process?
There was, a guy named Bruce Odom who was hired as the manager, and I was the assistant manager, and I turned around and there was no one to manage because it was just the two of us, um, but I a lot of it I got from him, like ideas about how to remove doors and things like that, and then but a lot of it I had to make up on my own, and I think a lot of it came from realizing the importance of what we were doing and how we had to figure it out. And it wasn't, once we did figure out, okay, this is how we do it, and this is how to do it safely, and this is how to save the most materials, then the challenge wasn't over yet, because then I had to figure out, how do you do it and compete with a machine that's destroying it in a day, right? It's not that we're just taking buildings down. We are trying to take those buildings away from demolition machines, right? They're destroying the building so efficiently that it makes it hard to compete with. So we've had to go further um, in our effort to save those buildings. It's not just the hard work of disassembling it, it's figuring out how to take that machine, that building away from the machines, is essentially, and in an effort to keep it out of the landfill, because so many people are in favor of what we're doing, but then the caveat is, but only if it takes the same amount of time and about the same cost, and then we're in favor of it. So we've had to work for years to be able to challenge mechanical demolition.
Did you have to then figure out ways to work faster, and then also, I guess, did you come up with any strategies, and then also for reducing the cost?
Yeah, every strategy that we, you know, every project we looked at it as, we're doing this wrong. And it's okay because we're new at it, but we're still doing it wrong. And there must be a better way, right? Every time. That led to new strategies of like, how do you, if you make a mess, then you got to clean up the mess, so we try not to make a mess while we're doing it. So saves labor, and labor costs money. So then if you save labor, you save money. So then you can bid less. So another thing is that one day I spent the day taking apart the walls of a house, like the exterior walls of the house, and it was very time consuming, hard work. And at the end of the day, we had to denail everything, and part of those walls were recycled and part of them were thrown away. And there was a lot of time in denailing. We got back to the store and someone immediately wanted to buy the materials, the plywood and the lumber from the wall. And I said, "Oh, that's great. We just got it here. What are you going to do with it?" And they said, "We're going to build a wall." And I'm like, "What?" Like, wait a minute. There's something wrong here, and so I almost instantly realized that I should not take the walls apart if someone's going to put it back together. What if I just sold them the intact wall for their shed that they were building, right? And so that was 20 years ago or more. In construction, they're called prefabricated panels. Like you could buy a prefabricated wall that's built in a factory. So we call ours post-fab panels, meaning they don't go to the house, they come from a house. And people buy them, and if they say, "I want to build an 8x12 shed," then we'll cut out an intact section of floor that's 8 foot by 12 foot, right? And we'll cut out two 8-foot walls and two 12-foot walls, and we'll deliver them a package of walls and floors, and they can build their shed, and they can have it almost done in a few hours. And it works for like emergency housing. It works for if you want a backyard office or something like that. And um, remember that win-win thing? It's such a win-win because I didn't have to take it apart. You don't have to put it back together. We saved 100% of those walls, right? We even saved the nails. We saved the paint, things like that are in those walls. And the walls come with siding on them. They come with windows. So they're cheaper than buying the materials used at my place. So like if you bought the individual materials, it would cost you more than it would the wall. And you'd still have to put it back together if you bought the materials. So, and if you bought it new, it would cost 3 times more. So, and then you'd still have to put it together. So what we've done is we've figured out with these post-fab panels, we've figured out how to make deconstruction more efficient. We can get the job done faster. We can bid cheaper. And the farther we go with this, the more likely it is that we'll, be able to dominate demolition, and maybe replace it to some degree.
That's so cool. And yeah, I was reading how you sell kits, and I wanted to ask you about that and how those came together. If you were taking the materials and then building these structures separate, but it sounds like you're able to take whole wall and floor systems and use those.
Yeah. So sometimes, you take apart a house and you could build a couple of sheds, out of that, and then have a bunch of extra materials as well. But other times, if the project is the right fit, then we'll take apart the building um, in such a way that we label all of the parts, and then it gets reassembled again. So that's a something when you think of like historic preservation projects, right? Like there's um, a historic building in Savannah, Georgia, where we they didn't want to lose it, but it was too expensive to move it, and so we disassembled it into sections, and then it was reassembled. Um, so that preserves history too, and if it can be done more affordably, then it promotes historic preservation. So now we've found a way to we could assemble affordable housing faster and cheaper. We could preserve more historic buildings. We've created more jobs. We've saved more materials. We've competed with demolition, you know, and so a lot of things are moving forward in that way.
Is that in line with code regulations and things like that? Can people build like ADUs, or is it can they only use those materials for sheds and things like that?
Well, different states have different rules, and so like in Washington State, you're allowed to use reclaimed lumber to build new structures, but there are restrictions, but it is allowed in certain ways. They'll have to get engineering involved and things like that to get approval. So it can be an uphill battle, but that's something I can't fight that battle because I'm too busy trying to save things. But when you turn a house into sheds, nobody's monitoring that. Nobody's um, like most places we go. There's some limit of how you could build a small structure without needing a permit. Like a storage shed or something like that. It can be a certain size, and then after it gets too big, then it becomes a permitted structure. So we most of our time is spent on these smaller structures that but our purpose is to see that the materials get reused. So it doesn't matter to me so much about how they get reused as long as they get reused, because the waste stream is like a river, and it never stops flowing. And so you can't just stop and talk about it. You can't just stop and think about it. You if you do, then that much material just goes floating right by you. It goes just flowing right to the landfill. So we've decided, like while people are thinking about it, like permit people, we're going to build hundreds of structures that are permissible in order to save that material. So some of the code, is about how thick the walls are, to be able to put enough insulation in the walls, right? And so that I would hate for that to be a reason not to do it. And then a lot of people are just behind the times, where they don't even know uh, the the strength or the suitability of reclaimed lumber versus new lumber, and so they just restrict it because they don't know, because they haven't looked into it, they haven't studied it. But we've studied it, and a lot of reclaimed lumber is stronger than the new lumber. So they're letting the new lumber go, so they should let the stronger reclaimed lumber, you know, be used. But construction industry isn't quick to change. So, but I think more and more places are are um, are seeing the benefits of reclaimed, and frankly, a lot of our materials, like when you think of cabinets or doors or lights, or flooring, reclaimed wood flooring is really popular, and it has nothing to do with code. It's just it's a material that we save, and we save that it has a great look, and it's stronger than a lot of the crap that's sold nowadays, and
Yeah.
so we don't spend too much time worrying about that. That's never stopped me from moving forward.
That makes sense. And there's a lot of artisans out there doing really creative things with some of these materials. Um, but I did want to ask you about what are some of the biggest misconceptions surrounding reuse?
One of them would be that reuse of materials and recycling of materials are on the same plane. So for years, even the green building community was treating reuse and recycling equally. Like I recycled 10,000 pounds or I reused 10,000 pounds, like that was similar. But reuse is 10 times better than recycling. Um, so that's because recycling takes a whole lot of added energy input to create a new product out of it. It's still better than disposal, but it's not better than reuse. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that um, that statement I made about is reclaimed wood suitable for construction, and there's always going to be examples of used reclaimed wood that's not suitable. Like someone that drilled a huge hole in it to put a pipe through it. Well, we're not trying to reuse that one. We're not trying to do anything that would uh, be to the detriment of the industry. But we are trying to show people that reclaimed materials are far superior to any new materials out there. And I'm sorry for all those new materials and what having to compete with us. When you flip the script, right, and you say, um, what are misconceptions about new materials? Um, that would be maybe a better question, because they have the budgets to promote themselves and to say we're great. And I'm like, no, you're not. Not compared to us anyway. And so what we're doing, like for example, when we compared, a study was done, it compared reclaimed lumber and flooring to new lumber and flooring, like manufacturing it new or reclaiming it used. And it took 11 to 13 times less energy to to reclaim the wood than it did to manufacture the new wood, and it created about 3 to 5 times less greenhouse gas emissions. So when you just look at that one statistic there, and it's like there's absolutely no comparison when you compare those two together, right? As far as which one is better. And so when you the more reclaimed wood you can incorporate, the better. Some people will say, but yeah, we still have restrictions. And I'm like, there's load bearing walls in homes, and there's non-load bearing walls in homes, right? So then there are places like a non-load bearing wall that's basically just holding itself up. It's not holding the ceiling up. um, those walls, they maybe use some reclaimed wood in that, and use, so you can still use some of the wood, but not have uh, a question about its strength or its suitability. But you have to get approval for this kind of thing, for your community. You have to know before you move forward, to make sure you don't get work with the inspector and tell them about these studies and things like that, and how building codes are changing. I know there are efforts to try and change the international building code, to allow for this too, so that it makes it easier for some other communities to adopt these rules. But so yeah, there are some misconceptions about used materials. There's definitely some misconceptions about new materials, and we all are just waiting for which new material is going to be the cancer causing, health risk kind of material that that we dread, and are wondering, how did we create this after we knew about so many other failed products in the past.
Yeah, yeah, there are so many chemicals used in new products these days, and uh, the ones from the past are just, they are what they are. It's wood without chemicals added to them for the most part.
Yeah, or glue. A lot of older buildings, there's no glue, there's no spray foam insulation, things like that. So not only are there not as many chemicals that could be bad for you, but there are fewer restrictions to reusing the materials. Like it's not glued together. So, um, but like one little stat that I like to throw out to show how sort of American construction works. Is in the 1890s. I think it was the 1890s. Germany realized that lead-based paint was bad for you. Everyone pretty much agrees lead-based paint is bad for you. So in the 1890s, they outlawed it and stopped using it, and so it took us basically 80 years after that information was available. It took us basically 80 years to stop production of lead-based paint. We were the
Wow.
last civilized country to stop the use of lead-based paint, and y'all can guess why that is. But all of the other countries did what was best for their citizens' health, except for the United States. And we put it off for 80 years. So if we had stopped in the 1890s, lead-based paint today wouldn't even be discussed. So I don't have much faith in the industry when it comes to doing the right thing. I think that doing the thing that makes money, and coming up with a product that is cheaper and easier for them, I'm sure they'll do that, but I'm not sure that it's going to be the best thing. I just know that we have the best options, for many reasons, and more and more people are turning to us. More and more people are realizing that we've always been here, but I'm trying to get the industry to a point where if that demand surges for our materials, that we have people trained up to do the work.
Yeah, that I wanted to ask you about that actually. With there's been such a big emphasis on carbon reduction, and especially embodied carbon. And so with that, like with lead, emphasizing it and things like that, have you seen an uptick in more designers, architects, things like that, trending towards reuse?
I definitely have seen that, and we've gotten involved in some of the biggest projects in America. As we work more and more in New York City, and we're seeing where these ideas are put forward first, are pretty early in the process. The ideas of designing the building to be more easily disassembled, right? Or the idea of using reclaimed, or the idea of saving things from the old building that was, has to be replaced. Those things are becoming more important to groups. And I think one of the things is that we use this example. We say, the industry says, look, I'm going to create a new light bulb and it's going to use 10% less energy, right? And that's great. So they just made a step. We just took a step forward. The only thing is the industry keeps expanding, right? We keep building more. So then what happens is you create a light bulb that everyone buys because it uses 10% less energy, but then you produce 11% more light bulbs because we're expanding, right? So what just happened? So now you're using more energy than ever. You're creating more of a carbon footprint than ever. The product that you created may take more energy and have more of a carbon footprint to produce in the factory than the old light bulb did. But you're like, that's okay because it uses less energy. It'll pay off over time. And I'm like, yeah, except that we are using more light bulbs. So we haven't solved anything, right? And then here I come along with a product that uses 11 to 13 times less energy to produce, And people are paying attention to that. They're like, well, finally, someone has come up with something that truly has a real impact on carbon and on the climate change issues, and all of that. But the thing is, we didn't come up with this idea. The first building ever built was probably deconstructed because people weren't stupid enough to destroy it after they spent all of that time, like cutting a tree down by hand and sawing it by hand. The last thing they were going to do was throw the wood away, after they were done with that process. Um, so things have been salvaged through the ages, and we're just trying to revive that effort that was kind of forgotten about for a few decades there. The fact is that when I talk about these numbers, I'm only talking about, like, if I took a building apart into 1,000 parts and I sold it to you, you would get those kind of numbers, right? But if I were to save a wall intact, right, or a floor intact like I do, it might be more like 20 times less energy is required, right? Because now I didn't have to take it apart, which is less energy inputted. You didn't have to put it back together, less energy inputted. More materials were diverted from the landfill into direct reuse, not recycling and not reuse in some other product. They were literally kept in place in the wall, which was reused. So that's those numbers we haven't run a official study on, but it's really encouraging to see what that is. So yeah, I think people in general are realizing that reuse is a huge part of the solution. It isn't the whole solution, but it could be a bigger part if we had more demand for reclaimed materials. And a lot of people think of reclaimed materials as like some antique doorknobs or some, like stained glass window or beautiful reclaimed wood. But we focus on trying to save everything, like whether it's just boring 2x4s and plywood, we're trying to save it so that we can show others that it can be saved and reused, and all kinds of practical applications. And we're happy to be in this zone where some people aren't they're not doing it because of the environment. They're not doing it because they're worried about the environment. They're doing it because it costs less, or they're doing it because they just make sense. It was ingrained in them not to be wasteful, by their family. And their grandparents, let's say, didn't throw anything away because they grew up during the Great Depression or something like that, right? And so you have people that are where reuse is common sense, and so we're trying to get everyone on board. This is not just an environmental effort. This is an affordable housing, saving money, historic preservation, job creation, and many other good things. There's all kinds of reasons to do what we're doing. But yeah, I think that architects. I was a keynote speaker at a conference of engineers, 800 engineers, and the great thing was, I was like, why am I here? That was the first thing I asked. And then, but the great thing was that the concepts that I talked about during the talk were still being discussed the last day of the conference. And so I think that was great to hear that, um, and show that, there is a lot of concern and a lot of interest in what we're doing.
I guess on that note, I did want to ask you, when it comes to architects and designers and engineers, builders, just the industry, I guess, integrating more reused materials into the built environment, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges or blocks? Why aren't, or what's keeping them from doing it more?
Well, there's a couple of things. Like, let's say that you had a used refrigerator, right? And you said, well, we should probably reuse that. But the thing is, we're we are watching the numbers, like when it comes to like, well, using this used refrigerator means we don't have to manufacture a new refrigerator. So that seems better, but maybe the used refrigerator uses a lot of energy to run, because it's old and inefficient. And so that may not be the best idea, right? And I'm okay with saying that because I am watching the numbers, right? I'm not just doing this blindly. Um, but but I think one of the biggest challenges for like a contractor, an engineer, an architect would be um, they want to specify a product, and but they have to have some assurance, when they do that, So like if we're working with a lot of architects right now, and they're wondering like how can we do this? Well, um, if they said, well, we need 10,000 square feet of flooring available on this date, and it has to be to this specification, and it has to be all the nails have to be pulled, and it has to be cleaned up or something like that. And it's like our industry is isn't we can't just dream up 10,000 square feet of flooring, right? Like we're not just we can't control our supply. We can't tell you 6 months from now what types of buildings will be knocked down because they're not our buildings. It's just whoever the phone rings and somebody says, I'm gutting a restaurant. The next phone call, I'm tearing down a barn. The next phone call, can you remove this shed from my garden? Whatever, do you want to come salvage this hospital? Last year, we did a hospital. We salvaged a hospital. We saved 3,000 items from a hospital before it was demolished. And we had 3 weeks notice to save 3,000 items, right? Like they knew this hospital was going to happen for months or even years, but I didn't find out about it until 3 weeks before we were supposed to start. And we still saved 3,000 items. So, but how could I have told an architect or designer that these hospital items would be available if I didn't even know it, right? So there's a concern about the supply and demand dynamic there. We can't seem to control either one, but we do our best, and I think that architects just have to be you know understanding that that's the nature of the business, and that they might have to be more creative. Like they might have to have a plan B or something like that, or be ready. Now, one of the strategies has been that like some of these projects in New York City that we're working on, there is an existing building there. That is a supply that we can control, right? Because it's our building, meaning the project team, it's our building. So if there's something in our building that we want to put in the new building, well, we control that material, right? So then it becomes like we can save that material and we can store that material until it's needed. And there's a lot of concerns like, oh, storage is so expensive. And I'm like, well, there are affordable storage options out there if you really think it through, if you try. But it is a concern, and so again, we're back to, even though we own the material, meaning the project team, right? Like I become part of the project team at that point. And even though we own the material, we still have costs of removing it, and we have costs of transporting and storing it. And versus new material, where when you need it, it's manufactured and brought to you. You don't have to store anything, and you can count on the cost. But we're finding that we're still competitive with, in many cases, we can be competitive with the new price. Even going through that process, because we didn't have to buy that material, right? It was our material. So that's some of the things that architects are facing. I understand that it's something that that they're fighting. A lot of our world is about do-it-yourselfers. It's about smaller contractors, landlords, agencies that help the homeless, I think that when it comes to like emergency housing after a flood, something like that, I think there's some potential in what we're doing. You know, like if we had a stockpile of walls and floors, if you know what I mean, then when they're needed, you could assemble an emergency shelter in less than a day using our panels. If you had a crew that knows what they're doing, they could have it. They could have it built by lunch, probably. We don't have to get in the world of architects and engineers and things like that, but we want to be in there. We want them to be involved, and we want them to keep trying to make this work for sure. It's just that I have a
Mhm.
lot of material. Remember that river of waste that keeps flowing by us? That keeps flowing. So we have to find every outlet for the materials we can. Our effort actually is involves everyone. The poor, that can't afford new, the rich that don't want to be wasteful, um, uh, contractors, architects, everyone. Everyone's involved, and or they should be, or we need them to be, because there's just so much to this. It's um, if we want to do this on a large scale, pretty much everyone has to be on board.
Do you ever recommend more tech-based tools have popped up over the years and databases like Reaply? Do you recommend the use of those for helping architects and designers specify reuse?
There's a lot of potential in those, if and and there's room for them to grow too. There's things that could be improved, but um, as long as everyone understands it's a two-way street. Like if if you were an architect and you said, I wish there was a platform like Reaply that listed all these materials so I knew what was available, right? And if Reaply said, I have 1,000 doors and they're going to be available on September 30th, right, of 2025. Because why would they? Well, because they're still installed and they're still in use. But on September 30th, we're going to, the contractor is going to remove them, right? So now there are 1,000 doors, what the doors look like, when they're available, and you can start planning for that, right? You can contact Reaply and start planning for that. But the thing is that architects also have to realize that their building that they're building, there's a building in the way of building their new building, right? So they're tearing down a building, and they need to make sure that their materials are listed on Reaply or something similar. And so, but they need to do that first, like if they've decided to remove a building, then the first thing they should do is try and let people know that's happening so that we have time to find a use for it. And so our efforts, like again in New York City, we are trying to list materials um, early so that we can find a demand for them before they ever get touched. And so we have one of the largest deconstruction projects in North America, which is in Manhattan. It's 500,000 square feet. It's a lot of material, right? And uh, in the future, the hope is that that material would be listed, maybe a year ahead even, and just so that people would know that it's coming, and maybe their project is also a year away, so that's not too early to find that out. I just think that that's something in the future, where you'll have, let's say, architects and designers and projects where they're planning on for what they're building, and they want to incorporate reuse. And then you have projects they're planning on what they're removing, right? And and so they're both planning ahead. They're both thinking ahead. If the first phase of any project is demolishing a structure, then that's the first thing you should be thinking about. Like, what do we do with the existing structure? Well, it's often the last thing they're thinking about. The hospital, can you imagine replacing an entire hospital? That's got to be at least a 5 year, 8 year process. And for me to find out in the last 3 weeks, is so ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
uh, I was literally the you know, first trade into the project when I was the absolute last one to know about it. So that's the dynamic that's happening now. There's a sequence and there's a way of doing things in construction. We are not part of that yet. It's up to the architect and the project owner, and that to make sure that we are put in our proper place, which is we need to we would love to know ahead of time, like um, so there are some things where we can't save it because there's no demand for something because we didn't have time to tell anybody it existed, and we're sitting there
Yeah.
sticking our neck out trying to save it when we don't know if anybody wants it. But if I had known for a year and someone had said, if let me know if you have any spiral staircases, right? And well, I could have, I would have seen it coming like 6 months ahead and say, yeah, in 6 months we're going to have this spiral staircase, and then if we could have ranged it so that we removed it and put it right on their trailer and they drove away with it the same day. That kind of efficiency, that kind of sensible approach, instead of just like everything is just total chaos and we're trying after the fact, after we already have things, we're trying to sell them. And that's not a good way to run any business, to do it on speculation and faith, faith that somebody will come in eventually, and you might end up sitting on that spiral staircase for 6 months waiting for the next person to come along, right? And the right person already approached you, and you just, the timing didn't work, right? So there's a lot that can be done, and I think valuing what we're doing is the first step. And as soon as people start valuing what we're doing properly, then they will, then these things will start falling into place.
Yeah, sounds like need advocates on the inside of these projects to uh, not only advocate for bringing you in, but bringing you in early into the process so you know what materials will be available and when. I recently read something that someone posted about reuse should be a regional thing, that they opted not to really get into shipping nationwide, things like that. What are your thoughts on reuse being kept regional?
Um, well, the first thing is that um, probably 99% of our materials are sold within a 100-mile radius. So that sounds pretty local to me, not even regional, but local. If you're selling used 2x4s for $3 and you could buy a new one for $4, well, you still save money. But if you had to drive 200 miles, the savings is lost, right? Because you lived 20 miles from the lumber yard. You could have driven just 20 miles and got $4 2x4s, or you drive 200 miles and get $3 2x4s. The numbers don't make sense, right? Um, so there's already a limiting, like there's a limit on how far people will travel to buy our materials to save that money. They there's time factor too. Like it took you time to drive that, and sometimes it gets like, okay, now we're an overnight kind of scenario, so that's getting even less likely. So we have no desire to transport things all over the nation, and add that carbon footprint, and that cost. But other times, like there be a piece of antique hardware that is completing some historic renovation project, and obviously that makes sense. Like that would be fine. So what I realized is that one of the problems with our industry was that you have like my high school. Remember my high school? It was demolished, and it was done in a quick period of time. If it had been saved, if it had been disassembled, that would have been a lot of material coming into the industry really quickly. And so So unfortunately, you think of like a flood, which is in the news a lot today. Um, flood would be like all this water is flooding into a community, and the only thing that can absorb it are like wetlands. Like somewhere where that water is kind of like absorbed and stored, and then it slowly flows out. So we've talked about the idea of regional warehouses, where when we get some huge um, huge quantity of material that no one individually could take, that we would have somewhere to put it and store it temporarily until we found demand, until we had time to slowly sell it down. Because sometimes there are these incidents like a hospital or a high school or whatever, um, where materials are, they're just too abundant, like there's too much stuff. So that's one of the ideas of having like a regional warehouse that where materials could be stockpiled and then sold, whereas the local stores, wouldn't have the room. So that material gets rejected or material gets lost. So that's what's happening today. Like if there's 100,000 square feet of carpet tiles or something like that, and we want to reuse them, not recycle them, but they all have to come out in the period of like 2 weeks or something, and it's like, wow, that's a lot to absorb. So, but if I knew that I had those in a warehouse, I could have 1,000 square feet of it in my showroom of my store, with the knowledge that I have another 99,000 available, So I think there's that idea of regional, but regional efforts when it comes to online platforms, also makes sense, right? That regional warehouse would probably have maybe an associated regional uh, website or platform, that would show all of its materials, so you wouldn't, you would know what's in the warehouse. You would know not only what's in the warehouse, but what's in all of the individual stores as well. So you would
Mm-hmm.
have an idea of what is, if I drew a 100-mile circle around myself, what materials can I access, right? Maybe then you could say, well, what if I drew 200 miles? Like I'm willing to go 250 miles, and to keep it local, to keep the carbon footprint down. What can I access within that zone? And so that's the parts about the regional concept.
I imagine there's a lot more materials than one might initially imagine. I wanted to ask you, you recently posted on LinkedIn that we're not just beyond recycling, we're also beyond reuse. What did you mean by that?
Well, I've been doing this. This is year 33, and when I first started, recycling was king. Like everyone was like, "We need to recycle. That's important." Um, and I agreed with them. Recycling was important, but I didn't realize just how much better reuse was than recycling when I first started. So then it was like, okay, can we go beyond recycling? That was a phrase that was thrown around. You know, can we go? Recycling is good, but reuse is better. So can we go beyond recycling? And because they realize recycling is probably not going to get us there. It's incredibly important that we recycle, but um, it's also very important that we try to reuse everything. You know, and then it's like, okay, well, they're talking about reuse, like take an entire building apart and save all the 2x4s, and then reuse the 2x4s, right? Or take a bunch of doors out and reuse the doors, or uh, save a bunch of clothing and sell it as clothing, right? Like that's fine, that's reuse. But when we talk about going beyond reuse, what we are doing is almost like what we call reuse 3.0, which is saying we're not just reusing the 2x4s, we're leaving the 2x4s in the wall and selling the wall, right? And so I'm trying to tell the reuse industry that what they think reuse is only reuse 1.0, right? Like it's just the beginning of what reuse means. So we're exploring what reuse could be, the limits of reuse. So when we when we take a building apart and we sell the parts, that's reuse. When we take a building apart and we reuse the walls and you build a new, smaller structure or whatever, that's reuse 2.0. But then if you say, if we took an entire building apart and then reassembled the entire building, that is, that's the next level. That's building reassembly. That's not just building reuse. Um, so reassembly is beyond reuse, and rebuilding is beyond reuse. And then when we take out wood flooring and we reuse it, that's great. But when we take out wood flooring and we offer a service where we reinstall the flooring, that's beyond reuse, right? Like we aren't just leaving it up to chance. Today's contractors are often, a lot of them are hesitant to use reclaimed flooring because they think it's a hassle. And it's like they work hard. It's a very hard job. And they're like, man, my job is already hard enough and I'm using new flooring that fits together well and it's clean and everything. And so a lot of new contractors don't want to touch reclaimed materials because they're like, it's too much of a hassle. So then we say, okay, we're not going to leave it up to them. We're going to do it ourselves. So reinstallation is beyond reuse. And if you think about it, um, when I remove the flooring and I reinstall the flooring, then I've completed the cycle, haven't I? Like the flooring was in use, and then I removed it and I put it back in somewhere else, and now it's back in use. So I didn't leave it up to the industry to save that material. I saved that material. We saved it. We salvaged it. We found a buyer and we reinstalled it. And now that flooring, I know that flooring is back in reuse, and I controlled that whole process. So when I build a building out of it, out of materials, then I don't have to wonder if that material was ever reused. I reuse that material. So that's what I mean by that. It's semantics, but basically it's saying, yeah, it's reuse, but it's beyond our definition, our current unofficial definition of what reuse is. So so that's what we're trying to stress, is that we're taking control of the circular economy, right? We're taking control of our share of the economy in general. There's the linear economy that we see today, and then you have the circular economy, which is often, these grassroots efforts and things like that, and they're great, but like there's a point where you become strong enough and adept enough at doing this that you can kind of take control of more and more and more, and the more people we get involved in, especially locally, the more synergy we build, you know, and so we can control more and more of the local economy and move it towards a circular economy. And that's why we're training other people to do it, because it's so important, that we help them do it as well.
And so is that what you're doing in New York? I know you've referenced New York a few times, and you have, from what I've read, kind of a big operation going there. What are you doing over there?
Well, the operation in New York is new, so it isn't big yet, but we have big projects, that are coming up. So the projects that we have are our New York City Circular Construction Network. Um, the collective projects have a project budget of $3 billion. Just to put it in perspective, it's not billions of dollars, but it's not, millions. It's like these are big. Generally, some of them are pretty big projects, some of them are smaller. It's a good way to get started, to have projects that have a lot of materials one of the challenges in New York City is just transportation and all the expenses and the labor and everything. It's all very, rent is super high, right? And so I had to come up with, yet again, I had to come up with a business model that works in that environment. And this this model would be more towards, instead of selling like raw materials, like selling doors and selling cabinets and things like that, we would be making value added products um, out of these materials. So we would first save the materials from buildings, and then we would save wood, and we would save glass, and we would save metal, um, and then we would form those materials into a product that's worth more. And so we call that remanufacturing or creating value added products, because we're adding value to those materials by assembling them in such a way. It might be room partitions, it might be reclaimed content, soundproof phone booths for offices, or it could be conference tables, or it could be light fixtures that are newly manufactured and have reclaimed content in them. But what are we
Mhm.
doing? We're basically we're saving the materials, and we are making a product that is worth more, but we're making it to the standards of an architect or designer or engineer or building owner. So now, instead of the architects wondering like, how do we change for me, I'm saying, how do we change for you? So now I'm rising to their level of specification and stuff like that, so they can specify a product. It's going to be a reuse store. Well, the Reuse Innovation Center in Brooklyn will be it will incorporate reuse and remanufacturing, also repair and workforce training, things like that. So the hope is that the showroom of that center, once it's started, will contain up to 50 products that will be reclaimed content and things like that architects and other, homeowners who, building owners can come and look at, and they can choose to specify those materials over something from the linear economy. So it's a complicated effort. I'll just say that. It's hard.
It sounds like it, but it sounds like it's going to be amazing. Any parting words of advice or wisdom for maybe for architects who are thinking about reuse?
I would tell them to start today and to start somewhere, and to say, if you were to climb a set of stairs and your goal is at the top of the stairs, you still have to take the first step, right? And so the first step might be that you specify some reclaimed wood in the lobby of the building, like a feature wall, which is just like a bunch of reclaimed wood on the wall of the lobby behind the reception desk or something like that. Something that isn't structural and it isn't large scale. But I think that we need them to start today, and we need architects to understand that it is a two-way street. So it isn't just about saving your own material. If you want circularity, you have to buy circular. This is not a one-way street where some architects feel like they get off the hook by getting a salvage company to come in and save some things. Well, they added to the supply. That's good. That's half the battle. But they didn't increase the demand for the materials. So architects are supposed to be on both sides. They are supply and demand. So just keep this statement, which we really realized the meaning of it in New York City, where there's such a supply, right? And if you want to be circular, you have to buy circular. So if you're not incorporating, reclaimed materials in your project, then you haven't really helped our industry out. Um, the most powerful thing in our industry is demand. In fact, the normal economy, the common statement is supply and demand, but in the circular economy, it's demand and supply. If someone is saying, look, I've got a $10,000 check, you just have to come up with this material, then we'll probably come up with the material. if we know that there's some big payoff. But otherwise, it's all speculation for us, and it's keeping a lot of people from doing the right thing because there's such risks, of sticking your neck out. So I could get a contractor that's never done anything related to this to instantly switch if I showed them the financial benefits of it. They would be like, yeah, of course I'll do that. That's I would love to save that material. But otherwise they say, oh, that's just a bunch of junk. I don't have anywhere to put that. I don't want to risk that. And so it changes the conversation quickly. So, but architects are a huge part of it. Um, and um, and I think that they're learning. They really are in New York City, especially where the city of New York has has started you know circular construction guidelines. Where they are mandating circularity in their own projects. So then those architects are having to really scramble, right? Because if they want to be a part of these huge projects, they have to learn quickly. So and incorporate these design principles immediately.